Good afternoon, everybody. Today is the 5th of May, 2022. As you are joining, please go ahead and take the first poll. Polls will appear throughout our community of practice conversation and will give panelists the opportunity to assess who's participating with us and will help to guide some of our discussion. So as people are coming on just right at the 1:30 start time, which description best fits you? Choose only one. See, already we've got large representation from the non-governmental healthcare community, government employees, faith-based leaders, students and advocates. Almost 50 of us now at the very beginning. Let us move to our second poll. My knowledge of the built environment and environmental racism. None to little, basic, or advanced. All right, I think the majority of those gathered so far have a basic understanding. Looking forward to rich and deep discussion today. And for those with none or little, welcome to this conversation on environmental justice and environmental racism, and glad you can be a part of it today. A few housekeeping matters before we begin. For those of you who are social media inclined, the hashtag HCHMD community and our handle, our Twitter handle, @HCHomeless. These will remain consistent throughout every community of practice conversation. We encourage you to extend what you are exploring and learning here with those in the virtual space that you interact with on social media. Live polls will be launched throughout the discussion. As I mentioned before, they are completely anonymous, so we encourage you to participate in them and click on them as soon as they appear on your screen. 2.5 years ago, 160 people representing 100 different organizations gathered at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum in downtown Baltimore for a day of very intentional conversation and discomfort about the structures and policies and practices that maintain conditions of homelessness and only exacerbate them. At the end of that day of very intentional cross-sector dialogue, we stood back, sat back, adopted thoughtful poses, and said, okay, so what? We got people together, we had these great conversations. What are we going to do with them? How are we going to further them? How are we going to move toward some shared understanding and collective action? What came next, of course, I needn't tell anybody present, was a global pandemic that immediately surfaced with Black and brown people dying at twice the rates of everyone else, the exact same structural inequities and realities that we were wrestling with together at that community convening on homelessness 2.5 years ago. And so in early 2020, we collectively launched a community of practice on homelessness. You are now attending the 10th consecutive session, the 7th consecutive topic, looking at racial inequities in health, housing, the building of community trust, addressing trauma, food insecurity, restoring, reimagining restorative justice, addressing disinvestment, displacement, and gentrification. And now looking deeply at environmental racism. As I walked to this session, I'm actually sitting in Healthcare for the Homeless's downtown 421 Fallsway Clinic. I walked under the Jones Falls Expressway, past people that were leaned up against the columns sleeping there. We're 2.5 blocks from the city's largest shelter, which is pressed up against a major highway thoroughfare in and out of town, and is right across the street from the largest prison complex in this region. It's a fitting time and a fitting place to talk about environmental racism and injustice. Let's not forget that amid the pandemic, racial inequities are exacerbated, especially for distressed communities of color. I must note that earlier this week, in fact, yesterday, we surpassed 1 million COVID-related deaths so far in the United States. We just passed the 52nd consecutive observance of Earth Day. So we recognize that environmental injustice and racism continues to disproportionately affect communities of color, a topic that we will explore today. So this session, for those of you who have participated before, and I encourage you to share in the chat whether you have been to a community of practice before, share your name and identity so that others can get to know you. Is this your first session, your 10th session? Has anyone been with us for the entire series of conversations? Those of you who have will know that this has been an evolving format. This is much more like a fireside chat than a webinar or a conference. I will begin with one question for all panelists and ask people to introduce themselves within the context of answering that question. We'll then have some directed questions where panelists will have the opportunity to discuss with each other. Throughout, please direct questions to the Q&A box below and make use of the chat box to communicate with people throughout the session. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Catalina Rodriguez Lima, the Director of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. Welcome, thank you for being here today. Dr. Marianne Akers, Dean and Professor of the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University. Welcome, glad you can be with us. Dr. Zacoby Wilson, Associate Professor of the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health, Director of the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health at the University of Maryland College Park School of Public Health. Dr. Wilson was supposed to appear in court today at the exact same time, and maybe 20 minutes ago, learned that they had won the case and that he could actually be with us here to engage in this conversation. So we welcome you. As I mentioned, I'm going to ask each speaker the same question. You'll each have about 4 minutes, and I ask you to include an introduction of yourself and your background while answering that question. So to all speakers, the environmental justice movement defines the environment as more than merely a place for the conservation and preservation of natural resources. It has evolved to identify the environment as a place where we live, work, play, learn, and pray. Movement supporters and participants recognize that environmental injustice and racism continue to burden marginalized communities of color and indigenous people disproportionately all across the United States, including in the Baltimore region. So through your own personal and professional lenses, how do you define environmental racism? And why is it so difficult to confront and address? Through your own personal and professional lenses, how do you define environmental racism and why is it so difficult to confront and address? I'm going to turn first to you, Ms. Rodriguez Lima.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation. Again, I am Catalina Rodriguez Lima. I am the founding director of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. Our office is a source of information for city agencies to overcome barriers impacting immigrants in the city of Baltimore. And our mission is to promote the economic growth, community well-being, and the integration of the 50,000 foreign-born individuals living in the city of Baltimore. In terms of your question, within the context of my work, a form of environmental racism can be government's posture on immigration as a national threat and their efforts to prevent unwanted migration with strategies such as employment sanctions, asylum and refugee programs, and the criminalization of undocumented immigrants. And by the way, this is not limited to federal government. This can also happen at local governments where some jurisdictions, not Baltimore City, would prevent, for example, landlords or houses from renting to individuals who are undocumented, or would utilize their police departments as pipelines for detention and deportation. While these strategies have been designed to manage and discourage undocumented migration or irregular migration movements, its effectiveness can be questioned as the increase of restrictive measures can not only contribute to a surge of migration, but it can also increase the risks of irregular migration. As it is the case with NAFTA, for example, which was featured as a way to reduce irregular migration to the United States from Mexico. However, its implementation negatively impacted poor and middle-class farmers in Mexico, forcing them to leave their country and move to the United States without a legal path. Another example, which is really relevant right now with the noise from various parts of the country, is the implementation of refugee and asylee policies and how these are limited to certain groups. In the last 30 years, these policies in the United States have moved from welcoming Cold War refugees from the East to exclusionary practices designed to keep out asylum seekers from Central and South America and the Caribbean. And so while these policies have been designed to manage the flow and resettlement of displaced individuals coming to the United States, these may be limited because they don't meet the realities of international population movements. As such, many are forced to move to the United States in search of a better future without a legal process to migrate, which ultimately impacts them once they get here because they have less access to resources and tend to be more vulnerable and marginalized.
Thank you. And we are certainly seeing an increase in the number of undocumented Latinx population members at Healthcare for the Homeless. 10 years ago, 3% of our client population identified as Latino, Latina, Latinx. Now, 10 years later, 34% of those we saw last year. And experiencing many of the challenges and fears and insecurities that you are identifying. Thank you for being with us here today. Let me turn to Dr. Akers. Same question, through your own personal and professional lenses, how do you define environmental racism and why is it so difficult to confront and address?
Okay, great. Thank you very much and welcome everybody to this conversation. I'm Mary Ann Akers and I am an urban planner. I am an immigrant. And in terms of the definition, academics usually try to shy away from definitions because it's a very complex situation when you talk about environmental racism. But in the planning field, we have dealt with this way before even the Green Movement came about. We all know that when the federal government and the Highway, for example, Act came on, we knew immediately that racism occurred where they would locate all these highways in low-income poor neighborhoods. So we have dealt with this forever and ever. Now, why is it difficult to confront? Those who know me know that I can be direct. So here's why. I believe personally, it's because usually voices or advocates for environmental justice do not represent the voices of people who actually feel them, who feels this racism, who are victims of these inequalities. And let's be honest, many of our green advocates are indeed, again, as I said, do not culturally represent the victims. And I think that's a major problem. And so later on, when we talk about possible solutions to this, I do have a disruptive solution to this. But that's why I think we've talked about this forever and ever, but the needle doesn't seem to move.
Right, and we will appreciate some suggestions for disruption very shortly. Appreciate your mentioning of the highway. Of course, as highways came in, low-income communities such as that completely cut in half and displaced by the highway to nowhere, a highway that was never completed, not far from where we are in downtown Baltimore, and just to my south, a highway that was supposed to cut through a wealthy white community actually was also not completed, but was completely stopped, and really led to the political prevalence of one of our past senators who organized against that highway and then became a senator in Maryland. So there is a complicated and very damaging history of environmental injustice and environmental racism right there. Thank you for raising that. Let me turn now to you, Dr. Wilson. Same question, through your own personal and professional lenses. How do you define environmental racism? Why is it so difficult to confront and address?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So when you think about environmental justice as a movement, just to say real quickly, it's a social movement. It's the child of the civil rights movement. So the environmental justice movement is a movement. It's about fighting against the differential burden of hazards and locally wanted land use, like incinerators, Willoughby incinerator in Baltimore, power plants and Brandywine, right? Those you go to Rehoboth Beach or go to Ocean City, those chicken farms, that's force fields of funk. Those are also EJ issues, right? Go to Washington, D.C., we talk about highways 295, go to Atlanta, all the 85s that move through Atlanta. We're talking about the National Highway Defense Act, 1956, right? Urban renewal with its own purpose, urban removal. They said, we don't want you anymore in these communities. That's on record. So in equities and planning zone development, the reason why we have environmental injustice. So you think about environmental racism, the term was coined with Reverend Dr. Benjamin Chapin in the fight in Warren County. Y'all know about environmental justice in Warren County, look it up. Warren County landfill fight, PCP fight, polyclonal biphenyls fight, 1982. But basically, they basically wanted to put this landfill, they just found this poor Black community for this unlined landfill, right? And so that's where the movement got its national attention. But the EJ movement is about what we live, what we work, what we play, what we pray, what we learn. Let me say it again for you faster or slower. What we live, what we work, what we play, what we pray, what we learn, right? So if you think about environmental justice as a social movement, it's about fighting against environmental racism. You can't talk about environmental injustice without talking about environmental racism. You can't talk about environmental racism without talking about structural racism. You can't talk about structural racism without talking about systemic racism. You got to talk about the stolen lands of indigenous brothers and sisters, right? And the stolen bodies of Africans who were used to build this country. So Jim Crow, Reconstruction, Jim Crow to now, that stuff is all connected, right? So you think about environmental racism, as it was coined by Dr. Benjamin Chapin in that fight in Warren County, it's the intentional, unintentional racial discrimination and the enforcement of environmental rules and regulations. So for example, Flint wouldn't have happened, the Flint water crisis wouldn't have happened. All they had to do was comply with the lead and copper rule. What happened in Flint wouldn't happen in Ann Arbor. Read the book Color Law. The target of communities of color for pollutant industries. Race is the biggest predictor of where environmental hazards are. The environmental science, I'm an environmental health scientist, the science has shown that, y'all. The work of Dr. Bullard, father of the EJ movement. Hey, go back to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. He's the great-great-grandfather of the EJ movement. Dr. King is the grandfather of the EJ movement. Last month, 54 years ago, he was assassinated in Memphis doing what? The Memphis sanitation worker strike, when Black men were being treated like dogs, like animals, and they were carrying around signs that I am a man, recognized by humanity. So communities that are dealing with environmental injustice, environmental racism are being dehumanized, right? Otherwise, marginalized. The carceral space, being jumped on, sacrificed those toxic trauma. So we're talking about environmental racism, right? And the fact that the folks who are making decisions, one, the issues of environmental justice, we're talking about recognitional justice. The folks that most impacted are not at the decision-making table in many cases. Zoning boards, planning boards. Let's talk about Baltimore real quick. Did y'all know that Baltimore, I already told you the answer. The first city in this country that had racism-based zoning was Baltimore. It got thrown out. So think about Levitt towns, racial covenants. Think about redlining. Redlining segregation is a driver of environmental justice, right? Zoning weaponized against folks of color. That was intentional, right? So you can't address environmental injustice without addressing, environmental racism. And actually, I think environmental racism is too nice of a term. Too nice of a term, folks. It actually should be called environmental slavery, because communities are being used to host these hazards, right? And they internalize their externalities, social, health, environmental externalities, right? Economic externalities, and they get trapped. Think about you live in a community exposed to lead. How you gonna put America first, folks? America first, folks. You gonna put your kids first. Lead puts a cap on kids' potential. So think about lead paint, lead in drinking water. Then you got a highway going through your community. Then you got to incinerate like Willabrator or the medical waste incinerator. Or you have the coal-fired power plant, or you have the coal pile explosion down the coal pile in Curtis Bay, Brooklyn, right? Or you go down and you go to Brandywine with all the power plants. Y'all got communities across the state of Maryland, communities across this country. You can go to Newark, you can go to San Diego, you can go to New Orleans, Uniontown, Alabama, you can go to Charleston, South Carolina. I know I'm talking too much, I need to pass the mic. Savannah, Georgia. I'll talk more about this later because I know my time is up. Yeah, I'm at 1:52. But environmental racism is real. It's just not about poverty. You got middle income Black communities, middle income Asian Pacific Islander communities, middle income Hispanic communities that are also being impacted by differential burden of hazards. So you're not going to address these issues just by looking at income and class. You got to look at race. Race is at the heart of it. I'll pass the mic back.
Race is at the heart of it. And wow, you just dropped a lot on us. This conversation is off. Dr. Wilson, we could pick up on any particular part of what you just presented to us today, and we could spend, my goodness, the rest of the week having this conversation. Force fields of funk is new to my vocabulary. I'm going to start using that now. What a powerful image that that brings up. Before we go further, let's launch our third poll. Which of the following is the most detrimental environmental hazard that distressed communities of color face? We're going to ask that you pick only one. Hazardous air pollutants, resource-intensive transportation systems, substandard housing and facilities containing lead, contaminated water, trauma and violence, public policies that perpetuate environmental injustice, political rhetoric that incites violence and further objectifies marginalized communities. Of course, if we let you choose all of them, we'd be checking all of them, right? Give that a second here. Go ahead and click that poll. There we go. Close to 40% public policies that perpetuate environmental injustice. Substandard housing, a leader there. Thank you all. Let me turn to you, Dr. Akers. Let's talk for a second about the built environment. Often regulated through zoning, it refers to the human-made environment that provides the setting for human activity, including homes, buildings, streets, sidewalks, open spaces, transportation options, and more. In Baltimore's built environment, environmental injustice persists where, as we've been discussing, hyper-segregated neighborhoods are exposed to hazardous air pollutants and environmental hazards due to immediate proximity, as Dr. Wilson was saying, to incinerators, industrialized areas, traffic emissions from highways, as well as abandoned housing. The results: increased asthma-related hospitalization rates, high rates of lead poisoning in youth, to say the least. And we know that people experiencing homelessness often try to find shelter in abandoned housings where they actually aren't considered by the most pervasive of federal definitions of homelessness to even count as being or experiencing homelessness. How and where do we start to address such entrenched issues? There are so many. And whose responsibility is it to address them? Dr. Akers.
Yes. So yes. So the built environment is, as we said, really everything that surrounds us that are built by designers, by planners, by people themselves. Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning did a study of homelessness in Baltimore about a decade ago, maybe 12 years ago. And our purpose was to actually, during the homeless census count, we wanted to look at the various environments in which they choose to live. And we noticed that, again, the correlation between the design of the built environment does have a bearing on where people choose to actually live. For example, we do the homeless count usually I think third Tuesday. This was a long time ago, but third Tuesday of in January, and we noticed we overlaid maps of the city and the environment, and we noticed that many of our homeless who are not in shelters actually go to where there are events. And not only that, we looked at the various how do you say this, in micro environments, and we noticed also that there was a correlation between their choice of location and the three walls that surround them. So in nook and crannies that have three, usually on the side and in the back, that's where they chose. And so again, of course, we observed that, but it would be good to do like a systematic study of the relationship of the built environment and racism and injustice. And so with that said, I truly believe that empowering the next generation of advocates in terms of the language that policymakers use and scientists use, I think is critical to make sure that the voices of marginalized communities are actually heard where these policies are decided at. So in the case of the role that higher education can play, it's important that we are looked at professors who are high up here, but that there are portions of higher education that actually can provide empowerment of marginalized people through knowledge generation. And I'll talk more about this, for sort of applied solutions to environmental injustice.
Thank you, Dr. Akers, and I appreciate your mentioning the annual homelessness count, which takes place in January. It's federally mandated on the coldest night in January.
Yes.
Where what do you do when it's cold, right? If you can, you double up with others. Suddenly the federal definition doesn't count you as homeless anymore. Mm-hmm. You go into an abandoned building, if you can find one, you're not enumerated as homeless anymore. Correct. So why is it that by design we've chosen the coldest night in January to enumerate homelessness to try to gauge the size and the scope and the magnitude of the problem? There's a enormous set of challenges right there. Thank you very much, Dr. Akers. Let me turn to you, Catalina, for a two-part question. So Ms. Rodriguez-Lima, I want to explore a question related to limited studies and work within the environmental justice space. Explore the relationships, specifically as you're talking about, between immigration, homelessness, and mobility. Poverty and structural inequities not only perpetuate homelessness for immigrant communities, but also expose them to air pollutants and other environmental hazards. First, will you explain the state of homelessness for immigrant families in the Baltimore area? as they navigate the realities of environmental injustice and housing insecurity?
Yeah, thank you. So as you mentioned, there is limited information about immigrant families experiencing homelessness. What I can share is some information about immigrant communities in general, and explain how some of their circumstances impact their ability to have a home, their ability to access resources. As I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, we have close to 50,000 foreign-born individuals in the city of Baltimore. Approximately 42% of them are limited English proficient, which means that they cannot read, write, or speak English, which means that unless public services have individuals who speak a second language or other languages, or have language access tools, these immigrants are essentially not accessing any resources because they cannot communicate with those entities. Half of the population is not US citizen, and this could include folks who have a student visa, a work visa, or legal permanent residence. However, some of these folks may not qualify for public benefits because of their status. According to the Migration Policy Institute, in 2009 in Baltimore, there were close to 16,000 individuals who were undocumented. And I want to pause here because oftentimes, based on our experience working with the community, undocumented individuals who are limited English proficient are more likely to be very vulnerable based on the fact that they don't have access to public benefits, they don't have access to resources. So I want to talk about this sector of the community. Approximately 3,000 of these unauthorized individuals have a US citizen child. And why this is important? This is important because some benefits are actually available to parents who are undocumented through their US citizen child. But oftentimes, families are afraid of contacting the government because of their status, or they think that this will harm their adjustment of status in their future. 25% have resided in Baltimore in the US between 10 and 14 years. I'm highlighting this because one, it demystifies this notion that immigrants are new to the city or to the country, when in reality, they've been here for quite some time. And they've been here under this irregular status, right? That basically limits them to access resources, benefits, and just become self-sufficient. 65% of them are actually employed. And many of them are in informal economies, like day laborers. And many actually open businesses. I don't know if you know this, but immigrants have twice the rate than natives to open a business. And a lot of that is not because they are extremely entrepreneurial. It's because they don't have a choice. If they don't speak the language and if they don't have a work permit, their only viable option is to open a business, which oftentimes are small. And I think you can see those throughout our city with the bodegas and restaurants. 60% of them are uninsured. And this is critical and was extremely critical during COVID, because as you may recall, I think the first message coming out of government was contact your doctor, right? When folks didn't have insurance or had a doctor. And during COVID in particular, undocumented immigrants were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic due to a series of reasons. They were more likely to be essential and frontline workers, especially in the service industry, which was decimated by the pandemic. Again, they had limited access to healthcare because, again, they don't speak the language. Even if they qualify, they may not know how to apply. Government systems are hard to access or navigate. They were excluded from the federal benefits. So they were not provided unemployment insurance or stimulus checks. And to this day, many of the families are still not be able, they still cannot access benefits and resources that can help them throughout the pandemic. And then despite all of that, because they had limited resources, they continued to work. And you can't really blame a family for trying to feed their children in a moment of crisis, if that's what they had to do. So they were forced in selecting to feed their children or continue to go to work sick, which essentially was terrible because it spread the virus. And then the last piece, which I think is relevant to today's discussion, is that many families live in multi-generational and crowded households. And this is not unusual. Throughout generations of immigrants, not just now, but through many, many times, there's an expectation and an obligation of immigrants that live here to guide newcomers, to help them facilitate the process of finding resources, which increases the success of foreign-born individuals. And so by having these social networks or immigrant groups that are there to support them, they can have access to employment opportunities, resources, and everything else. In fact, scholars argue that the lack of social capital or social groups, immigrant groups, can contribute to the poverty among newly arrived immigrants because they have less information about critical resources.
Yes.
And then as we recover from COVID, many families are struggling to remain in their houses for a couple reasons. They're threatened by landlords with ICE, with Immigration Customs Enforcement. Despite our city doing everything we can to make resources available to people, regardless with immigrant status or regardless of their language, many landlords refuse to participate in eviction prevention programs or don't want to get licensed so that they can be paid rental assistance. Relocation is very difficult because if you don't have a social security number, it's really difficult to determine your credit. And so you end up having to go with landlords, which perhaps are not the greatest landlords in place. And then I do want to go back to this notion of crowded households, which during COVID was seen as this contributor of the virus. And we often get calls of, there are Hispanics, there's 20 Hispanics in a house. But I think the reality is that this is a form of survival that has existed for generations. So the people are not in the streets and people can actually become self-sufficient. My husband grew up in a Nigerian household, and he always tells me that from the moment he can remember, he always remembers having someone in the basement, whether it was a friend, a family, a cousin from Nigeria, coming to Baltimore and then getting on their feet and moving out.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. And you're mentioning that 60% are uninsured. During the nation's last attempt at health reform in 2012 through Medicaid expansion and the Affordable Care Act, we notably did not include, and shamefully did not include, undocumented people. And you mentioned that even if people were eligible, there is often this fear of applying for public benefits out of fear of being identified and deported. That's something that we're going to need to address as a community. As people may know, this last legislative session, the Maryland General Assembly voted to expand Medicaid to include pregnant people regardless of immigration status, including 1 year postpartum. So in order for that benefit to be meaningful, we have to address this. And we'll come back, I think, later during Q&A to talk about some of the harmful narratives, and you mentioned some of them with respect to people who are undocumented living in this country, and how we can engage in counter storytelling to really begin to change hearts and minds and public policy. But let me move in the interest of time to Dr. Wilson. We actually have here, Dr. Wilson, that we were going to play your recording. Fortunately, we don't have to do that. Among the myriad social justice issues and inequities, and you mentioned so many of them, that communities of color have long navigated and are constantly addressing, environmental racism isn't always mentioned. As a society, why should we all prioritize addressing environmental racism, and what's at stake if we don't?
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it's important. It's an important topic. We do have, examples of environmental racism, as we've already shared. I like to say, we're talking about the social terms of health, and this is the environment. We could call it the environmental terms of health, right? Any of you may be familiar with salutogenesis, Antonovsky's framework about how do you promote health, wellness, and well-being across all dimensions of the environment: built environment, natural environment, social environment, economic environment, political environment, spiritual environment. That's your environment. And so your environment is proximal. So every day is pocketbook. You know, the environment is not something that's far flung away, but that is the environment. That's a biome. But I like to ask people, when you think about the environment, you know, what I usually think of, the first thing pops in my head is a polar bear with a Coca-Cola. That ain't your environment. Environment's right in your house. The environment's at your school, right? And so when you think about these issues of infrastructure disparities, right, environmental racism is a driver behind it. And you can look at Baltimore. I mean, Dr. Lawrence Brown's book, the Black Butterfly, we talk about, you know, the butterfly wings, East and West Baltimore, hypersegregation of Black people, right? In the body of the butterfly, you have your white residents. And you can look time and time again, the relationship between redlining, segregation, and income. Redlining, segregation, and lead violations. Redlining, segregation, and heat issues, right? What city in our state has more heat-related deaths, more hospitalizations and deaths? Baltimore. Impervious surfaces, too much concrete and asphalt, no trees. You know, you talk about nature gap. Blacks have 3 times less access to nature compared to the white counterparts. Low wealth people have 3 times less access to nature compared to their wealthier counterparts, right? Baltimore is an example of that. So you have those issues. And so if then you go from redlining, segregation, and also asthma hospitalizations, redlining, segregation, and life expectancy. You see association time and time again. And don't forget violence as well. So, you know, we have this new administration that's talking about, you know, it wants to address environmental justice issues. You have several executive orders that y'all may or may not be familiar with. You have Executive Order 14008, 13995, 13990, 13985. 2 are focused on climate change and 2 are focused on racial equity. And the one is the 14008 is really important for everyone. It's called basically the Justice 40 Initiative. As we move from a dirty energy economy to a clean energy economy, 4% of those benefits should go to disadvantaged communities. And it sounds great when you talk about benefits. But I'm gonna go old school on y'all. I mean, old school when y'all were younger. Remember y'all took chemistry class? Yeah, I mean, maybe some of you liked it, some of you didn't. Remember stoichiometry? One side of the equation is the inputs, other side is outputs, right? You can't get the benefits without the inputs. What about the money? Okay, what about the money? So the problem is with Justice 40, if any of y'all are looking in the news lately, you've heard about this mapping tool. You heard about CQ, Council of Environmental Quality. You've heard that they're going to address environmental racism while including race. How are you going to address environmental racism, folks, while including race? I'm gonna wait for an answer from the audience. You can't. It's not logical. It makes no sense. But what it is, it shows that how we, even when racism is in your face, this country, our leadership, our politicians, and a lot of advocates out there too, they don't want to talk about race and racism. They want to talk about income, poverty, because then they can blame it on you. The reason why you live in a community with EJ issues, the reason why you experience environmental racism, the reason why you experience environmental slavery, the reason why you're dealing with toxic trauma, the reason why you're in the sacrifice zone, it's your own fault. You didn't work hard enough. It's that meritocracy nonsense, folks. Let me tell y'all something about environmental racism in general in this country and opportunities. We talk about we don't have the playing field's not even. It's not the playing field's not even. One playing field has I used to play football, soccer, has nets, right? Nice white lines. The grass is cut. It's totally different playing fields. The other playing field has no goals, has no nets. The grass ain't cut. 2 different playing fields. So we're going to address environmental racism. We have to really acknowledge racism and then really focus on it. If not, we can continue to have policies that are race neutral, that are colorblind policies. And that's what a lot of, even our environmental policies, the Clean Air Act is a race neutral policy. The Clean Water Act, and because they are race neutral and they don't take into account the historic contemporary racism, that's why you keep seeing things happen like in Baltimore and Curtis Bay. That's why you keep seeing sewage backups for those who experience sewage backups in Baltimore. Think about how this impacts on homeless populations. That's why you keep seeing things like happen in DC with the pollution issues or lead issues, or the fact we still got lead paint and lead in drinking water in our country. Or we got communities down in the South, in the colonias at the Mexico border, brothers and sisters on reservations, or post-slavery Black neighborhoods that don't have their roads paved, that are not connected to publicly regulated sewer and water infrastructure, because we still keep focusing on avoiding racism. Okay, how much more time I have? I can keep going.
No, I appreciate you mentioning race neutral policies. And if I'm hearing you correctly, you would say there's no such thing as a race neutral policy.
The fact that you want to have a race neutral policy, colorblind policy, let me say this, y'all, that's racist in itself. I'll pass the mic back.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Before we proceed, let's go to our fourth poll. Which of the following is most important in our efforts to end environmental racism in Baltimore and other communities? For this one, you can choose all that apply. Address structural racism, diversify neighborhoods, reduce fossil energy consumption, educate Black, Latinx, Indigenous communities, organize around efforts to shut down and relocate incinerators, relocate distressed communities of color away from environmental contaminants, focus solely on one environmental issue at a time, fund and implement Baltimore's Red Line.
That's a good way.
So I'm seeing high percentage of people going with exactly what you're talking about, Dr. Wilson, addressing structural racism at its core. Thank you all. Let's turn back to you, Dr. Akers. In a Maryland Matters online news article, and this is addressing that last item in the poll there. Let's talk about transportation and the Red Line. In a Maryland Matters article, Dr. Larry Stafford, Executive Director of Progressive Maryland, a statewide nonprofit organization that advocates for working families and racial justice, stated that Governor Hogan's decision in 2015, man, seems like that was just yesterday, 2015, to cancel Baltimore's Red Line light rail project provides another example of structural environmental racism. He continues, Hogan returned $900, you talk about the money, Dr. Wilson, $900 million earmarked for the project to the federal government and redirected the state's share of financing to road projects that accelerate global warming and serve mostly white communities. What are your thoughts on Mr. Stafford's comments, and what effect do you think that Governor Hogan's decision has on communities of color in the built environment and on environmental protection and conservation? Dr. Akers.
Yes, so the Red Line has been a very controversial issue many years ago. And yes, that's a very good example of environmental racism, where again, it was important. Transportation is very important to connect people with jobs, people with opportunities, people with areas, healthcare, for example. So transportation is critical. And yes, that's a good example. But let's be very careful, because oftentimes when governments put money, investment in quotes, investment in these transportation lines, what may happen, and I have watched this nationwide over and over again. We think it will, these investments will help all these marginalized communities, but what happens? Gentrification occurs. There is a notion of the transit-oriented developments where, again, real estate development will take advantage of these investments and instead start developing almost high-end, unaffordable islands of new development. So let's be careful and make sure that these, like the Red Line project, will not actually be the foundation for future developments that do not at all affect the marginalized communities that we are advocating for. So it's very important that we do educate, and I think that was the third in the poll, educate our communities about how to fight and how to use data. That's why it's very important. Both Ms. Rodriguez-Lima and Dr. Wilson, they were citing all these statistics to empower our communities to be at the table. We need to center them, but center them in a way that their voices are to a large extent data-driven, because the data seems to be the source of real justification for arguments. And so it's important that education is, and HBCUs, historically Black institutions, are critical to this cause. But oftentimes, even in higher education, when we are pitted, when we write grants, for example, and we are pitted against other traditional universities, they think we don't have the competency. They think that we are less than those who have been getting all these grants. And so even in higher education, there is indeed racism. So we do have to, the HBCUs and marginalized communities have to have tighter partnerships, authentic partnerships.
Thank you, Dr. Akers. Yes, there's data and there's money, right? Let me turn to you, Ms. Rodriguez-Lima. I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to Dr. Akers. What are your thoughts on her perspectives?
Yeah, so in terms of transportation, for immigrant communities in particular, that is critical. In fact, many immigrants, as I mentioned earlier, are going to move towards these ethnic enclaves because they have social capital, meaning there are businesses that people can find employment. There are churches, there are resources, and oftentimes are within walking distance. But we are seeing pockets of immigrants growing throughout the city in places like South Baltimore, for example, which is completely disconnected from Southeast, which has the majority of resources and the majority of the immigrant community. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that many people cannot access services because they either don't have transportation means. And as a former immigrant who didn't speak English, I remember that one of the scariest things to do was to take public transportation and to end up on the wrong side of the city. So it could also be a very frightening experience. I agree with the doctor that transportation cannot come at the expense of our communities and should be centered and rooted in the voices of the communities that we are trying to protect and make sure that their voices are elevated.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez Lima. I would draw your attention to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And please, after this next question, we'll be coming to the Q&A portion of this segment. But before we do that, I want to turn back to you, Dr. Wilson, and give you an opportunity. I saw your eyes light up, $900 million. Talk about money turned back, and that's just the federal portion. What are your thoughts on Dr. Akers' comments?
Yeah, real quickly, I think it's transportation equity is a big issue. When you think about it, when you don't have access to, well, let me say it this way. Remember I say highways and byways run through communities of color disproportionately, right? So you do have some mass transit lines that run through our communities, but guess what? They're burning diesel. So you got the buses that come through and the bus depots that tend to be disproportionate in our communities. So that means when you're sitting there waiting on that bus, you're being exposed to combustion byproducts, and that diesel exhaust is 40 contaminants that cause cancer. Did you know when your kids are riding a school bus, short-term exposure to diesel exhaust impacts the coordination, the concentration, and focus? When you're exposed to it, it impacts yours as well. So we got to transition all those buses to be electrified. That's the first thing. So that's important. Well, also with mass transit, when you have transportation equity, and let me say, it's not just mass transit, everyone, it's also multimodal. We have some neighborhoods don't have biking trails, don't have walking trails. We need to make them pedestrian friendly. We need to reduce cars because cars do what? Produce pollution, but also greenhouse gas emissions, which contribute to urban heat-on effect. So think about in urban communities like Baltimore, you've been exposed to heat and air pollution at the same time because of combustion byproducts. So let's reduce the number of cars. Let's reduce the number of cars and buses that actually run on gasoline and diesel. That's important. And then when we do have more mass transit, I think that for each bus we have on the road, it takes off multiple cars off our highways. So there's some benefits there, but I do agree, we have to center community and really think about the 70 principles of environmental justice. So I put in the chat, Samuel Jordan, his coalition in Baltimore, BTEC, Baltimore Transportation Equity Coalition, they're fighting for that money to come back to build out the red line. We have under the infrastructure bill that was passed a few months ago, there's actually a lot of money in that bill for mass transit. So you should be advocating for the Baltimore mayor, the council, your Baltimore County delegation, Baltimore City delegation, the state delegation to Congress to say we need that money in our community so we get that infrastructure dollars to improve equity and access to transportation, but also other infrastructure too. I'll pass the mic back.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Turning to a couple of questions here. We have a question from Tamara Hicks. How do we address the link between the rent gentrification crisis that's coming and the resulting homelessness of forced displacement? Baltimore's prime for the same gentrification that DC has experienced. If you look at the number of high-end rental properties alone happening here in the downtown area, these will become the new unhoused / homeless. How do we address that link? Who'd like to take that one? Dr. Wilson?
I'll go real quickly. I mean, we have to have a affordable housing movement. We do have affordable housing advocates in Baltimore. In DC, for example, you have folks like Empower DC, Parisa Naruzzi, that focus on affordable housing. One of my colleagues, Robin Lewis, is focused on affordable housing. We have to have this whole concept called equitable development, right? So if equities in planning and zoning development drive environmental justice, well, equity in planning and zoning development will advance environmental justice. It's part in either Office of Sustainability and working the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. The sustainability plan has to have affordable housing and sustainability plan. But bigger than that, y'all, how many of y'all know about the zoning rewrite? Are y'all going through a zoning rewrite? Well, you should be in that zoning rewrite discussions to make sure that affordable houses included in the zoning rewrite. But bigger than that is your comprehensive plan. How many know about your comprehensive plan? That's the 30-year plan for your city, any city. This is what we'll be doing. This is how we can look at over the next 30 years. You got to make sure that affordable housing and equity and justice is built into your comprehensive plan. All y'all who on the phone right now, on the Zoom right now, wherever town you live in, you need to ask them, let me see the comprehensive plan for our town. Do we have equity and justice in the plan? Do we have transportation opportunities, food infrastructure to address food apartheid? Do we housing apartheid, recreational apartheid? All those things to be built into that comprehensive plan and the master plan. Okay, yes. I'll stop talking, but that's the place to go.
Thank you for
Dr. Wilson.
Dr. Wilson.
Dr. Akers, go ahead.
Sorry. Thank you for mentioning the comprehensive plan, because in Baltimore, and thank you, Chris Ryder, the director for the planning department. They are starting the comprehensive planning process. And I have not seen, I'm sure other cities have done this, but they have asked community-based organizations to actually be actively involved in getting people to these sessions. And I think that's critical, because in the past, what would happen is planners would go to communities who they don't represent. They do not even know the nuances, the culture of communities, and they go there and have meetings. What do you want? Or, what do you think we need? But right now, Baltimore, I think, is in the right track in their comprehensive planning process. So that is critical. Now, and that's, I go back to my I would say suggestion that this is where the HBCUs can really, really take an active role. And that's to educate citizen scientists, citizens who know, for example, what the zoning is about. The School of Architecture and Planning can give sessions around town about what it means, what really is zoning, so that when citizens from marginalized communities come to these meetings, they are ready to have a good strategy that's effective, and they have the data to show. But again, it's important really that we do educate people so that they will be at the table and really make a difference.
Dr. Akers, you raised the question that some people might have, what even is zoning? Tell us about the relationship between racism and zoning.
Okay, so zoning is an implementation tool that is used by cities based on the comprehensive plan. These are detailed regulations that govern many cities and municipalities. It goes to, for example, what the setbacks are, how many units, the footprint of a building in an acre, for example, in multi-family zoning, how many units are required here. And so these are really specific regulations that, and history has shown, that has really put gates for people of color and low-income people from coming to certain neighborhoods. So it's alive and well, and it's still being practiced. So.
And so much room for change there. Dr. Wilson, quickly.
Yeah, real quickly. So, and what happens in zoning, it gets weaponized against our communities. As I said, I think I said this. I presented the AME Church this morning. I may have said the same thing with some of these points. I apologize. I feel like I'm repeating myself. But also weaponized. So look at Julie Z's book, SZE, Noxious New York. But what happens a lot of times in communities of color, we get upzone. So it goes from being residential to then industrial. So you see that across the nation. That is, again, a form of environmental racism, y'all.
Yes, indeed. Let's turn to you, Ms. Rodriguez-Lima. In our last community of practice discussion, we talked about another hot topic, critical race theory. And we specifically addressed a key tenet of critical race theory, the need for counter narratives and counter storytelling. In some circles, people blame immigration for the country's environmental problems and hyper politicize this narrative without acknowledging the struggles that immigrant families experience, many of which you've discussed with us today, at the intersection of homelessness and environmental justice. Could you talk to us about the counter narratives that refute some of the hyper politicized claims that we hear?
Yeah. So there is a right movement. In fact, last year, the Attorney General for Arizona brought a lawsuit against the Department of Homeland Security, arguing that the Biden administration's policies on immigration impacted the state's environment by increasing demand for housing, infrastructure, hospitals, and schools. This idea is deeply rooted in right-wing environmentalism. And the solution to this problem, as you can guess it, is more borders, more walls, more exclusion, which is not surprising. But it's not necessarily rooted in protecting the environment. It's simply another tool, another weapon to use climate change against immigrants and communities of color and of course, poor people. This has proven to be dangerous because this rhetoric is actually costing the lives of immigrants. The shooting in 2019 in El Paso that left 23 people dead was perpetrated by an individual who intentionally targeted Hispanics, blaming them for water pollution and overcrowding, which seems to be a topic of discussion. And also, let's really call it for what it is, like this theory of white replacement, right? But although these groups that continue to blame immigrants for environmental problems, I think the science indicates that it is the world riches who are driving climate emergency, right? In fact, 23 million people in the world have been displaced by climate or extreme weather events. This means that the people that are coming to the United States are likely coming here because of climate change and environmental events. But when you talk to immigrants and when you think about the immigrant experience, you often hear about people fleeing violence and people coming here for economic opportunity. In fact, when I talk to my constituents, I often try to ask them, where they're from, why they chose Baltimore. And I ask them, right, like what drove you to be here? And they often tell me, I needed a job to feed my family. But if you dig a little deeper, I remember this one gentleman who said, I ran out of my job stopped. And I asked him, what was your job? And he worked at a coffee farm in Honduras. And And so he told me that his coffee farm had been experiencing a lot of drought over the years and that essentially stopped producing. But you're never going to hear immigrants say, I'm here because of climate change. They're going to tell you, I'm here because I need economic opportunity. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that we in some ways are causing migration and are blaming them for their situation here in the United States. So thinking about that and challenging those narratives, same thing, I go back to the overcrowding discussion, which, you know, right movements are talking about impacts in housing and infrastructure. For generations, immigrants have lived in homes and are expected to help new arrivals on these migration flows.
That is a very deep observation. We are causing migration and then blaming people for it. I'll note in the chat that Eddie Martin Jr. has shared links to environmental justice and critical race theory, specifically focusing on counter storytelling. So would draw your attention to that link, as I would all of the links that are shared here in the chat box. Terry Fitzgerald notes, just in closing of this section, how can we even talk about the changes in development, environment, et cetera, unless we discuss changing the structure of society? I think we're all feeling this frustration a little bit, right? And government moving power from those who have it now to communities who should have it. Any quick thoughts from panelists on power sharing, power reallocation, on power taking?
Oh no, thank you for that, because you set me up well with that softball pitch. Energy versus power. That's the theme of our next symposium. We're going to talk about power shifting. August 11th and 13th, y'all, it's going to be virtual. August 11th and 12th is going to be in person on campus August 13th. But that's the thing. We got power. I talked about empowerment, y'all. You said, Dr. Wood, you didn't say that right. You mean empowerment? No. Empowerment. How do we use science? How do we use data? How do we use information? Well, I love James Brown. But he said, talk about give us that right on information. Y'all know that James Brown song. You know what I'm saying? So how do you give people information? Critical literacy. How do you help them connect to the power they already have? You already have power. How do you build our collective efficacy? That's empowerment. So yes, power shifting. We have to change the culture in many of our institutions. We have to make sure that people, let me tell you, I know I'm talking too much. Let me tell y'all something. When you vote folks in, that's not enough, right? Like if you hire me right now, would you wait 4 years to evaluate me? Why would we do that with politicians? No politician goes to politician school. Y'all heard what I said? No politician goes to politician school. We got to train them up. We got to hold them accountable. From day one, they get their agenda out there. We got to be saying, what are you going to do? What's the 10 points? And then once they get elected, you're not going to door day one. You're not going to door month 6, right? That's part of what we have to do. We have to be more accountable. And to make this democracy work, it takes work. We got to put that work in, okay? And you got to join social movements. This system of oppression that folks are dealing with, whereas environmental racism, environmental justice, what's happening now with reproductive rights in this country, LGBTQ, homelessness, it's all the same stuff. We got to bridge across our social movements. Let me stop talking. Pass the mic.
Democracy takes work. So give us those dates again for the symposium in August.
Oh yeah, get too excited, y'all. That's my Mississippi and me. August 11th through the 13th. I'm from Mississippi, by the way. Go ahead, sorry.
Quickly, Dr. Akers.
Yeah, and you know what? I really have high hopes for our young people, and not only young, but people who are disruptive. And mind you, we do need some disruption in order to change the system. Now, I'm not talking about disruption that can lead necessarily to violence, but some type of disruptive strategy that we know will have an effective outcome at the end. And that's why it's really, really important. When I say educate citizen scientists, I do not necessarily mean you have to have a PhD, okay? Although we do know that education, a college degree, for example, could or is a social and economic mobility factor. We know that. But at the same time, you don't have to be a PhD in order to be a citizen scientist. I love the term of being critical thinkers. I think that that's very, very important. And our young people are up there. The millennials, they're up there. They're disruptive. But here's my kind of advice to the millennials is do not forget the older ones that have come before you. It's important that you do heed advice, you do heed wisdom, because we have gone through so much as well. So that's my spiel.
Can I just say one last thing?
And then for the older ones among us, know when to get out of the way. Ms. Rodriguez Lima.
Yeah, like the only suggestion I will say is when you are pushing for something, think about who's not in the room. And I talk about that because, like, ideally my office wouldn't exist because city agencies will think about immigrants immediately when designing programs, but that is not the case. And we're essentially trying to work ourselves out of a job because there isn't a culture of thinking about these populations right away.
Thank you. Yes, your office should not exist. We're very glad that it does exist. Let me turn to you, Dr. Wilson. In his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Dr. Ibram Kendi states, do nothing climate policy, and this kind of goes to what you were saying about policy earlier as well. Do nothing climate policy is racist policy. Race neutral policy, you might say, is racist policy, since the predominantly non-white global South is being victimized by climate change more than the whiter global North, even as the whiter global North is contributing more to its acceleration. It very much goes to what Ms. Rodriguez Lima was just talking about earlier as well. What are your thoughts, Dr. Wilson, on Dr. Kendi's statement? Given Dr. Kendi's perspectives, in what way is the liberation of the non-white global South from the manacles of environmental racism bound up with the liberation of communities of color experiencing the effects of environmental injustice all across Baltimore?
It's very connected, and you get me really excited when you start talking about liberation. I haven't said this yet, y'all, but also I do liberation science. So we talk about the symposium and the center that I run, we're about empowerment science and liberation science. Okay, just put that out there. The statement is very powerful. You know, those who produced it, like the global North is producing more of the greenhouse gases because we're consumerism, right? We consume a lot of fossil fuels. We are drunk on fossil fuels in this country. Coal, you know, oil and gas, right? Y'all heard my Mississippi oil. I can't say it right. The kids get on me about that. But coal, oil, and gas, okay? And so who's impacted? So when you're extracting those things, who's impacted by the burning, right? You got the folks, as I put in the chat, as was said earlier, the biggest driver of refugees in the world right now is climate change, right? So you got desertification issues. You got what's happened to a lot of our farmers. Think about indigenous brothers and sisters in the Amazon and the loss of their natural habitat because of trees being knocked down for cattle farming, right? You can look at a lot of this. We talk about Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, right? Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Florence, Sandy, Michael, et cetera. Think about tsunamis and what vulnerable populations are disproportionately impacted by tsunamis, right? Think about Haiti and how Haiti's been hit several times by climate-related perturbations, right? Think about our island nations, right, that are disappearing because of sea level rise, okay? So you look at what's happening on the continent of Africa. We got multiple parts of Africa. You look at South Africa, where didn't Johannesburg almost run out of water a few years ago, right? So that's come back to the US. This is very much connected. One example, just a quick example, is Nigeria. You have a lot of oil and gas extraction and that's impacting Ogoni people. Think about the African diaspora in Nigeria. And then some of that oil gets refined. Think about refineries in Cancer Alley, that 80-mile corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, right? Think that petrochemical corridor in Houston, right? The largest petrochemical corridor in the country. So you see these connections between extraction, combustion, and impacts global North, global South, but also in our own country. Let me slow down a little bit. Most environmental justice issues, when you talk about differential burden of hazards and local land uses, most environmental justice issues are actually energy justice issues. Let me just slow down a little bit because I know I've been talking too fast. So we go from extraction of oil and gas wells, NWCP's reports, cold blood and fumes across the finish line. Communities of color are most impacted. We get the transport pipelines, Atlantic Coast Pipeline, where our Native American brothers and sisters, communities of color disproportionately impacted. When it comes to processing, I already mentioned Cancer Alley, I already mentioned refineries down in the petrochemical operations in Houston Ship Channel, refineries in Newark, refineries and also in places like Richmond, California. Communities of color disproportionately impacted. When it comes to combustion, whether it be power plants or when we burn fuels for our cars, right? Whose communities? We're talking about highways and byways disproportionate to Black and brown communities. Our communities are disproportionately impacted. We're getting the asthma and the heart disease and the stroke and the cancer and the infant mortality, birth defects, reproductive effects, right? Mutagenic effects, mutating your DNA. We're getting all that. And then the waste. So in the whole life cycle of fossil fuels in the US, communities of color and low-wealth communities are disproportionately impacted, okay?
And this is only going to intensify, wouldn't you say, as resources become more and more depleted, and as we do ever invasive ways of extracting more and more of them out of the soil. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Let me turn to you, Dr. Akers. Let's give you an opportunity to respond to Dr. Wilson. What are your thoughts on his perspectives?
Yes, so I agree with a lot, and I'm telling you, Dr. Wilson, you have a lot of data to really show the inequities between North and the North and Global South. I come from the Global South. You know what irks me the most is when people from, and I'm not saying you, but people from the North that tell us what solutions we should have in the Global South. That really irks me, because in the first place, that's why when I say we need to center the voices of marginalized communities, I truly mean it. We need to center, for example, the voices of fishermen, fisher folks in these islands, you know, and listen to their narratives rather than, and mind you, I have been in this country more than I was in the Philippines, but mind you, there are times I catch myself when I go back to my motherland and start, you know, telling them what to do. I have to catch myself. Whoa, I'm like a colonizer. I'm telling them what to do, and I have not listened to their voices. So it's critical if we want to say the Global South does need really a very, very, I would say, well, authentic assistance. We first need to center their voices.
Yes, and you raise a challenging question for all of us. In what ways are we colonizers? With about 10 minutes left to go, we knew this hour and a half would go incredibly quickly, and it certainly has. We come to our rapid fire section of the program, 1 minute answers. The first question to Ms. Rodriguez Lima and Dr. Akers. Let me start with Ms. Rodriguez Lima. Where do we begin the work of dismantling the environmental racism that plagues Baltimore's built environment and the most distressed communities when we're dealing with so many obstacles and priorities, hello COVID, in our own lives? Where do we begin? Catalina.
I think I'm muted. I think we start by recognizing it, right? And questioning how different groups and systems are disproportionately to blame and face disproportionate impacts. And then the last piece I would say is, you know, humanize people. I know that sounds simple, but if we know that our communities, if we hear a rhetoric, and again, I go back to this overcrowding example, if we hear of this rhetoric of immigrants impacting the housing sector, without understanding the realities, we are not necessarily humanizing and putting ourselves in their shoes.
Dr. Marianne Akers,
yeah.
Where do we begin?
So I would say storytelling. When you talk about centering marginalized communities, you need to step back and let them talk about their experiences. And until we are able to, and I love that term, Ms. Rodriguez Lima, about we have to humanize our marginalized communities, but just listening to their narratives is very important. And then we start then maneuvering and shaping their narratives so that this can be powerful tools to give to the powers that be. But storytelling.
Storytelling and counter storytelling, I might add. Yes, yes. Rapid fire question for you, Dr. Wilson. How can we do more to protect the health and quality of life for persons experiencing homelessness and navigating environmental injustice? You and I talked a lot about this during the planning call for this session. What can we do to eliminate the added psychosocial and physical stresses of environmental racism for this population already dealing with the enormous weight of homelessness?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a socio-ecological model approach, you know, we got folks on the individual, but also families. We got a lot of families who are actually in transition, right? So really trying to have we need to provide wraparound services, one-stop shop services for folks, right? And also what happens a lot, and you think about when we have vulnerable populations like folks who are in transition between homes, or who are homeless, or folks even in our, maybe who are in the prison population, right? You know, we tend to put them in spaces that we want to otherize them. You know, we see them as viruses, right? And we get them infrastructure that reflects our sort of negative treatment of them. So we have to really have a different approach. Remember I said salutogenesis. We have to take a salutogenic approach to really addressing the issues of homelessness and giving people the access to the best infrastructure, whether it be food infrastructure, housing infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and healthcare infrastructure, instead of doing the opposite, right? And so I think that's part of what we need to be able to do. And also we have to change some of our public policies that make sure, like our zoning policies, our planning policies, our community development policies, that provide opportunity structures for folks who are homeless so they can get access to affordable housing, get access to healthy infrastructure, and get access to those economic opportunities that they also need. Thank
you, Dr. Wilson. Now for our final question for participants, and we've got a little more than a minute per answer here. We can do about 90 seconds. If you could equip participants with one tangible way that they can address environmental racism in Baltimore, what would it be? If you could equip participants with one tangible way that they can begin to address environmental racism in Baltimore, what will it be? Let's go to you, Ms. Rodriguez-Lima, to start us off.
I would say solidarity. There are many groups working on some of the issues that I've discussed today. So educating ourselves about the issues that are being confronted by the groups that are exclusively working with immigrants would be a good start.
Excellent. Solidarity. Dr. Akers, one tangible way.
Self-reflection. As advocates and as human beings, we need to know what lenses we are using, because if we don't do that, we will be perpetuating the frameworks and the structuralism that we are trying to fight. So I think self-reflection is critical.
Excellent. And to you, Dr. Wilson, one tangible thing.
Yeah, I would say join the social movement. We do have the Mid-Atlantic Justice Coalition that includes folks from Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and DC. We have a Maryland state table that's part of the Mid-Atlantic Justice Coalition led by Wakiria Poole with Central Depot, you're familiar. And then in the Baltimore area, we have groups like BTEC, Samuel Jordan's group. We have the Baltimore, South Baltimore Land Trust, right? We have folks working on incinerator issues, sewage backup issues. Casa de Maryland also has been part of, we actually had a day in Annapolis to talk about EJ issues. We talked a lot about what's happening in Curtis Bay, Brooklyn. So the fight against incinerator, the fight against, fight against food waste, the fight against traffic issues. So engage with those groups who are part of that EJ movement in Baltimore are very important. But of course you got Baltimore Rise as well, and other kind of the fair development movements as well. So all those movements need to be, you need to bridge across those movements, but really engage in that social justice, environmental justice, climate justice movement.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Please join me in thanking our speakers today Catalina Rodriguez Lima, Director of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, Dr. Marianne Akers, Dean and Professor of the School of Architecture and Planning at Morgan State University, and Dr. Jacoby Wilson, Associate Professor, Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health, Director of the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health at the University of Maryland, College Park School of Public Health. Thank you to all of you who have leaned into this conversation today, asked questions, participated in the chat, clicked on links in the box today. Thank you to everyone involved behind the scenes in making this work. It seems so seamless, but there is an awful lot of work behind the scenes that make the community of practice work for us all. You can register to attend a strategic planning implementation session on July 7th. We've got the link in the chat here. Healthcare for the Homeless is going through right now a strategic planning process, which we do every 3 to 5 years. And we're working to reimagine how we address our agency work through a racial equity lens. We invite you to join us as a community to reflect upon your own strategies to create a more equitable environment for your staff and the communities that we serve. These sessions will be a very important part of our strategic planning process. Your homework until the next community of practice session is to do the work. Take note on the content from this online forum. You will receive information immediately after that contains all of this information. Continue to engage in a process of self-examination and reflection, developing your own racial equity lens, applying a racial equity lens to your work and the work of your organization. Think concretely, develop the capacity to understand that it's not enough to be not racist. We've been saying this from the beginning of our sessions together. It's not enough to be not racist. There is no such thing as a race-neutral policy, as Dr. Wilson reminds us. We all must work to be anti-racist in our thoughts, our actions, and our work. Only then can we truly start addressing racial inequities in a range of contexts, in a range of levels. However, it starts internally, frankly, even at home, before we even make it into the office. Participant lists will be distributed to all panelists. This is fundamental to a community of practice, but if you do not want your name and information included, please let us know. It's right there, communications@hchmd.org. By the end of the day tomorrow, let us know if you don't want to be included. We encourage you to be included, and we encourage you when you get the list to reach out to others on that list. Continue a conversation that maybe you started in the chat box. Then we can continue our important work together. And with that, let me just say thank you for spending time today discussing environmental racism and environmental injustice. Thank you so much to our panelists, and have a pleasant Thursday afternoon.
Everybody, y'all take care.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.